Okay, so this video is going to be a review of our Reconstruction unit. And remember, Reconstruction is kind of the time period immediately following the Civil War. And it typically is regarded as between 1865 when the Civil War ended to about 1877 when the North agrees to pull troops out of the South. Arguably it can go a little bit later than that when you get the implementation of Jim Crow laws and the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, at the very end of the 1800s. So, as you all probably remember, the end of the Civil War really left the South with some pretty serious problems. Most of the major fighting had taken place in the South, and this really left the whole South in trouble. You had many towns and the cities that had been destroyed or in rubble or in ruin by the fighting that had taken place. You had plantations and farms that had been burned, and things like Sherman's March to the Sea. And as a result, you also had some serious infrastructure problems. Roads, bridges, and railroads had also been completely destroyed as part of this war effort. And you really have some other problems kind of coming from the fact that you had a large number of these Confederate soldiers had been killed or wounded, and they were casualties in this war. And when it comes down to it, Reconstruction being an attempt at rebuilding after this war, you're going to be rebuilding without the help of so many of these men who are going to now be out of commission after the war, either from having been killed or wounded. So as I just said, this period after the Civil War is going to become known as this Reconstruction Era. So while Abraham Lincoln was still the president, during the war actually, in 1863, he issues what is known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. In other words, this simply just becomes known as his 10% plan. And this was really the first attempt at trying to reconcile with the Confederate States, trying to ultimately bring them back into the Union, and how things are going to take place once they were to come back into the Union. Ultimately, this plan was that when 10% of the voters of each of these states took an oath of loyalty to the Union, ultimately that's when the states would be able to reform the government, in a new constitution without slavery, and be allowed back into the Union. This really was meant to encourage the Southerners to kind of rejoin the Union and take charge of their local and state governments. Lincoln really didn't want to punish these people. He felt that the war was really punishment enough. It was problem enough for these people. The effort, as we just said, left the South in ruins, and he really didn't want to add insult to injury. He really thought that was just going to kind of hurt this effort and really just add a whole lot more bitter resentment based around it. So you have this word amnesty that's really important, and I just kind of want to reiterate what that actually means. In this case, amnesty is actually a pardon to really all of the white Southerners took place in this rebellion. Really all of them in this case except for the Confederate leaders. But anyone who's really willing to swear the loyalty oath would be accepted. So in contrast to what Abraham Lincoln was trying to get past, you have the radical Republicans in Congress really feeling that Lincoln's plan was completely just not okay. They felt it was too mild, and that the country needed to take a much tougher approach on these rebels who had left and created such a problem of the Civil War. So they really felt that Congress should be the ones that were controlling the Reconstruction policy, and that it really shouldn't be coming from the president. One of their main leaders was a man named Thaddeus Stevens, and he felt that really all of these Southern institutions, and there's a quote here, must be broken up and relaid, or all of our blood and treasure will have been spent in vain. And really what that means is just that we just spent years and years in this war, and countless resources and dollars and many lives and such, and that if we don't treat these people harshly in the South, these rebels, that all of this is going to be spent in vain, obviously. So Congress tries to put forth this thing known as the Wade-Davis bill, just to kind of show you the position of these radical Republicans. And only white men are going to then be able to rejoin these constitutional conventions and rejoin the Union if they had sworn that they never had taken up arms against the Union. And that's really a tall order. You're not going to find too many people that had not actually fought, in this war or, been part of the war. And really, when it comes down to it, former Confederates are going to be completely denied, public office or any shot at public office, and that all of these states are going to have to adopt a new constitution, a new state constitution, that's going to be abolishing slavery when they come back in. So this Lincoln felt was just way too much and too harsh, and he ultimately vetoes it and doesn't actually get passed. But I just wanted to kind of show you the contrasting different opinions here, going into the Reconstruction effort. So ultimately, Lincoln is assassinated not too many weeks after he is reelected. In April in 1865, Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. by a man named John Wilkes Booth, who was a Confederate sympathizer. He is the man up here on the right, where I'm circling with my mouse. And this wasn't just a plot to kill Lincoln. It was actually a much larger plot. They wanted to take out a number of these different officials. They actually attacked William Seward, who was the Secretary of State as well, and they also, thought about taking out Andrew Johnson. And Seward was actually attacked in his bed, but he wasn't actually fatally wounded by a man named Lewis Powell, who is the guy down here. And there was a big manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. The story, is that basically he shoots Lincoln up in his booth, up, in this theater. He actually jumps off the balcony and lands. He breaks his leg and ends up, getting on the run. And ultimately, there's a big manhunt before they catch him. And ultimately, you're going to then get a new president, Andrew Johnson, who had been the vice presidential pick in this re-election in 1864 for Lincoln, mostly because he was a Southern senator that never left the Union. He was really supporting the Union throughout the Civil War, which is really rare, obviously. And he was actually a Democrat. And the reason why he was chosen, toward the end of the war, was really to try to show national unity and trying to help this effort that's going to be taking place after the war, because he is a Southerner. And Andrew Johnson has a bit of a different plan of how to handle the Reconstruction, and this is going to ultimately become known as this presidential Reconstruction period before Congress is able to come into session. And Andrew Johnson, he doesn't necessarily have too much of a desire to help the newly freed men. He is from Tennessee, and being from the South, he doesn't necessarily have this desire that someone from the North or maybe an abolitionist would have had. He didn't necessarily come from money, so he didn't really like the upper classes, the aristocratic classes of the South, who he felt were really the big proponents of starting this war. But ultimately, you're going to have a number of pardons, being issued, and amnesty being granted to all of the soldiers, the common person in the South, but other Southerners, your aristocratic classes, are going to, have to come and swear this oath of loyalty to the Union, which we'll talk about in just a second. So this is just a picture of Andrew Johnson, just so you get a little bit of a look at what these people actually looked like. And going further into the presidential Reconstruction Plan here, these high-ranking Confederate officials and wealthy landowners who really Johnson felt were the big reasons why this war took place, that these people were only going to be able to be pardoned by personally going to Washington and ultimately personally applying for this pardon to the president. And ultimately, you also are looking to appoint governors in southern states, requiring constitutional conventions. Only these whites who had sworn this loyalty oath would be able to vote. And really, in order to get accepted back into the Union, right, this constitutional convention, they had to accept the 13th Amendment, this abolishing of slavery, to be able to re-enter the Union and really declaring the Confederacy dead, denouncing secession and just declaring this war effort dead, and really this bitterness between them. So you're going to have a number of Reconstruction amendments, really just three: the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So this is just the 13th Amendment right here. Section 1 says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So obviously this is abolishing slavery completely, and that's obviously a huge deal, as the Civil War, was partially fought over this issue when it really comes down to it. So throughout the fall of 1865, you have these southern states really starting to follow the presidential Reconstruction rules, and and the states creating new governments, ultimately following these. And these previously, these high-ranking officials that had made the trip to D.C. to get their pardons, they're ultimately going to be the ones that are going to be made the representatives in Congress. So when Congress comes back in session in the spring of 1866, they show up looking to be able to start participating in the government. And it's really funny because the congressional Republicans who are in the North don't agree with this, and they still have this attitude that ultimately being very lenient on these people coming back in, and that's what they feel Andrew Johnson had done at this point. They actually refuse to seat them. They don't let them in, and they don't let them participate. And this is going to be really, it's going to come back because as a way of trying to counter this, the southern legislatures now throughout the fall and into 1866 create what's called these black codes. And these black codes are these things that are aimed to really control the freedmen and to really try to enable the South to exploit these African American workers, these freedmen workers now, and to limit their mobility and such in these states now. So I have written here, these black codes ultimately trampled the rights of the African Americans. You had things that basically you had fines for unemployment. Other parts of these codes, banned African Americans from owning or renting farms. You had orphans and refugees, being put into unpaid apprenticeships. So this really is a big deal, and these are extremely limiting to these freedmen. And when it really comes down to it, these black codes originated as slave codes, and the only real difference between these slave codes and the black codes are essentially just a changing in the wording. So instead of saying, the slave can do this or can't do that, it's basically going to just simply say the Negro or the freedmen can or can't do this. And really the question becomes, is this just slavery in disguise to some extent? Is the South trying to control and manipulate these people as much as they possibly can? Ultimately, Congress is going to challenge these black codes. So early in 1866, you get Congress, taking their first move, and they ultimately authorize special courts that are going to prosecute the people that are doing this, that prosecuting individuals that are being charged with violating the rights of these African Americans. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 comes later. And the Civil Rights Act is really, it's a pretty sweeping legislation. They're going to be pushing for the granting of full citizenship to African Americans. The federal government, is going to be given the power to intervene in state affairs, especially in these cases like the black codes. It does also just simply overturn these black codes. And this is going to really be the basis for what becomes now the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is just right here, and I guess I'm just going to read it verbatim for you guys. So the first section says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So a couple last things about the 14th Amendment. Additionally, this amendment is going to stop prominent former Confederate officials from getting into national or state offices unless they had been pardoned by Congress. So this pardon by the president isn't going to hold up anymore, and this is going to really bring us into what's the next period of Reconstruction, known as congressional or even radical Reconstruction. Congress also declares that the South is going to have to ratify this amendment, these southern states, to be readmitted into the Union, and this is going to set them off in the South a bit, and it's going to cause a lot of controversy. It's going to lead to some race riots that erupt in Memphis and New Orleans that get pretty bad, and we watched that in the documentary we did in class. What is congressional Reconstruction? In other words, also known as radical Reconstruction. And you have to remember, these radical Republicans, they are against the South in a lot of ways, right? They want these freedmen to have these new rights. They want the South to be ultimately punished for their actions in the war, and they're actually able to get a supermajority in the House and the Senate after the elections of 1866. You have to keep in mind that the southern states haven't all come back into the Union yet, so it's a lot easier for these people to get these elections and get into office, and ultimately, by having this majority in Congress, they can really pass whatever legislation that they want. How the bill, the law process works, it goes through the houses of Congress and then ultimately gets signed or vetoed by the president. And if Andrew Johnson vetoes their bill, in this case, with this large majority that they have, they can actually overturn his veto. So even if the president disagrees and doesn't want these things to be passed, then it doesn't matter because Congress can still pass them. So that's what they start doing, and you start getting these, what's known as the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and actually also 1868. And these things that are passed, for starters, require the southern states to actually adopt new state constitutions that are going to need to be approved by Congress, and these new state constitutions are going to be forced to ratify the 14th Amendment, and they would need to do this before they're actually going to be accepted back into the Union. You also have, the biggest probably part of this is the fact that you're now going to divide up the South, really the 10 southern major states, into 5 different military districts, and each district is going to be under the command of one of these military generals. Some of these generals like Grant and such are going to be in charge of some of this, and these generals and this military is going to really act as the active government for the region, and this is going to just ultimately provide a whole lot more tension in this area. And there's going to be thousands of troops that are being sent down here to enforce this. This is really pretty much a military occupation of this area, and the South's really not going to be too happy about it. You also have in these Reconstruction Acts, again, forcing them to recognize and guarantee these freedmen the right to vote in the state elections. This is just a map of these military districts. You can see, the different districts. You have Virginia up here, you've got North Carolina and South Carolina as the second one, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama as the third, Arkansas, Mississippi as the fourth, and then ultimately Texas and Louisiana as the fifth. Tennessee, which was a southern state, actually was able to rejoin the Union before these acts were placed, so they actually didn't have to fall into this. So how does this turn out? When it really comes down to it, the southern states really they refused to kind of do this. They refused to take part in these elections for the state constitutional conventions, and creating these state governments. They didn't want to do it, so they refused. And that hurts them to some extent, because when you have this new wave of African American, the freedmen voters coming in and being given the right to vote, they are going to be voting in every way against the interests of the South, well, at least the Southern whites, I should say, because they're voting for their interests, which is opposite of what the Southern whites are really wanting, and they're voting Republican, the African Americans anyway. They're voting Republican because, remember, the Republicans are the ones that freed them, and that one source that we looked at in class with the quote, stick to the end with the party that freed you. That's what they're doing here, right? The freedmen are going to vote Republican because they have been helping them all along. They've been advocating for them all along. And this is going to ultimately give these state controls to the Republicans. And when that happens, the states, slowly start getting these constitutional conventions, and they start slowly being brought back into the Union. So this is just another map. It also shows the military districts, but really what I want you to see here are the dates that these states now start trickling in. As you can see, Tennessee was the first in 1866, and then you have, a wave of them in 1868, and then 1870 is really the next big one there. But it just shows that these states are kind of lollygagging. They don't want to get this done. This is now. These last ones to rejoin are 5 years after the Civil War had ended. So it just goes to show how much they were resistant and not willing to be reconstructed, if you will. So President Johnson was really strongly opposed to how Congress was dealing with all of this. He was opposed to this radical reconstruction, this congressional reconstruction, and remember, he was a Democrat. The Congress was mostly Republican, and a lot of these radical Republicans even to begin with. So Congress, again, they have the power to do what they want here because they can overturn Johnson's veto, so they start passing laws that are actually going to limit Johnson's power. The first one that they actually pass is known as the Tenure of Office Act, and that was passed in 1867, and what this is going to do is it actually prohibits the president from removing government officials from office without the approval of Congress. So that's going to limit him a bit, and you're going to get a challenge by Johnson against the Congress, and ultimately Congress is going to push right back here in a second. So this little squabble between the two actually leads to President Johnson almost being removed from office for impeachment, for being impeached, I should say. So you have this conflict between Andrew Johnson and Congress over this Tenure of Office Act, and really you have the person named Edwin Stanton, who is the Secretary of War, who really, while he was in Johnson's cabinet, he really kind of pushed against Johnson in a lot of ways. And Johnson, when this act came out, he wanted to prove a point. So he actually removed Secretary of War Edwin Stanton from office, and this creates a big problem because Congress had just passed this as a law, so if the president is going against this, it's technically unlawful. So ultimately, you get a vote for impeachment in Congress. The House of Representatives actually votes to impeach him, and Johnson is actually spared in the Senate by one vote, and as a result, the impeachment actually fails, and Johnson's able to actually serve out his term. But again, with the way this is set up now, with Congress having such a majority, Johnson really can't do anything that he's looking to with the remainder of his term. This is just a picture of the trial, just a drawing, any artist rendering. I thought that was interesting. You can take a look at that if you would like. So now with Johnson's term kind of winding down, you are going to have a new election in the 1868. The Republicans choose Ulysses S. Grant, the general who kind of saw the Civil War through to its completion. That's who they choose as their candidate. The Democrats choose a man named Horatio Seymour. Based off of the differences in the voting now in the South, and now the fact that your African Americans are going to be able to vote with the laws that had been placed in the Reconstruction Acts, you are going to have this go very smoothly for Grant. And, you can see down here he wins electoral votes by quite a bit. The popular vote isn't quite as close. You can see that right down here where my mouse is, 214 to 80, and the popular votes only wins by 300,000 or so. But though, again, the African Americans are the ones that make the difference here in this vote. So here is just a picture of Grant. This is him later on, and yeah. So one of the big things that Grant does in his first term is really help see through the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment here is the one that ultimately allows all citizens of the United States to vote. And it also includes, well, I'll just read it. So the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So as you can see, this is really big. You've now had these three Reconstruction Amendments, which are 13, 14, and 15. Remember, the 13th is the one that ultimately abolished slavery. The 14th is the one that now made all of these people citizens of the United States. And then this one is the one that makes them allowed to vote. So the way I like to remember this, as long as you remember that the 13th and 14th, 15th are the ones, if you think of it as free citizens vote, then again, you can just line it up right there and you should know which ones are which. So I've kind of held off on talking about some of the more social issues that are going on during this Reconstruction. And this is going to be a big one, which is this sharecropping, which is going to be really the most common form of work for these freedmen after the war. If you remember from class, we actually had read one of these contracts for the sharecropper, and you know that ultimately these people are going to get paid very little bit. The way it works is, right, you enter in these contracts to rent these plots of land from a landowner, and ultimately you're going to be asked to share a certain percentage of your profits with the landowner. And between, all of this and how high the percentage is and buying the supplies and things like that, you're ultimately going to really have pretty much nothing left. And when it comes down to it, there's really no upward mobility here at all. These people are, while yes, they're working very hard, and in fact, it's really not much different than, slavery. You can see the conditions down, here of what some of these quarters looked like. They're really not much better than what it was like when they were enslaved. And in some cases, they probably were even using, the old slave quarters that the plantations had as, where to stay. So when it comes down to it, this really isn't, again, much better than slavery, but this is what they had. Otherwise, they would have been stuck doing nothing, right? And they wouldn't have had anything. They wouldn't have been able to provide for their family at all. They wouldn't have been, they were refugees without anything to do after the war. And that's going to lead us into our next little bit of a social aspect here, which is the Freedmen Bureau. So the Freedmen Bureau was set up right at the end of the war as a way of trying to help transition these newly freed slaves into society. And one of the big things that the Freedmen's Bureau is looking to do is, again, help with these people that had been stuck after the war, who are essentially war refugees. You're looking to distribute food and clothing and medical services. They actually try to help educate these people by establishing schools. Additionally, these people could help with settling disputes between the Southerners and the white folks that are coming back into their lands, having disputes over land ownership. And that's actually one thing I forgot to mention in the last slide about sharecropping, is many of these people who had been kind of granted some of this abandoned land after the war, when you have the whites coming back, they're being kicked off, and it's tough luck for them, sadly, the way the system worked, but those are the ones that ultimately get stuck going into these contracts now, as far as working on this land. And the Freedmen's Bureau is trying to really help these people transition back into society. So this is just a page that appeared in the Harpers Weekly in 1868 about the Freedmen's Bureau. And you can see, on both sides you have the white Southern culture here that is aggravated with the freedmen over here, and the freedmen are obviously aggravated with them. You can see the tension, they're carrying short swords and muskets, and you've got pitchforks and scythes and other things over here. And you have the uniformed Freedmen's Bureau man, who has this military authority to try to settle this dispute in the middle of them. And ultimately, you're going to get the South pushing back against all of this, right? The Republicans were really only able to stay in power in the South with this black support that they now are able to vote. Remember, that's the whole stick to the end with the party that freed you bit that's allowing them, again, to stay. So really, what the South is looking to do is they're looking to push back and thwart all of these efforts of the African Americans to vote in certain cases, and they want to preserve their kind of former way of life. And that's when you get what's the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And as we saw in class when we looked at those sources, you can see the disruptions that the KKK caused. You have a lot of violence. They're really running kind of an intimidation policy and scare tactics, and in certain cases not even intimidation, because they're actually getting violent. You have things like lynchings, beatings and things, and in many cases they're actually doing this to straight up disrupt the voting. You actually have instances where they disrupt the actual polling places, try not to let these African Americans vote. But this is obviously a big deal, and this is one of the things that is just going to make this whole thing even more crazy down in the South. So with some of that pushback, you actually get propaganda, obviously, happening as well. Everyone understands what propaganda is. It's something that's meant to elicit a certain response in a biased way, trying to get you to see a certain perspective in the biased way. So you have this propaganda right here in front of you. This is the Freedmen Bureau, right? It says, you can see, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president and made law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. When you look at this picture here, in the middle you have the depiction here of a freed man, and it's a very racist depiction, right? You have this pretty stereotypical, heck, even non-really even person looking, African American here in the middle, just kind of sitting around lounging, while if you look here, you have the white man working, right? So this is basically saying that they are willing to take these government handouts that the Freedmen's Bureau is giving them without working, and they're doing this on the backs of the white man, and it's obviously negative towards the Freedmen's Bureau, and actually even positive toward the president, right? If you sustain the president, you protect the white man. So it's just trying to make you believe that, and when people are seeing this and being fed this day in and day out in the South, the people do actually believe it. And this is just another one, and it kind of has the same implications here, just in a much more compact package. You actually, you have here, right, the Democratic platform is for the white man, and don't forget the Republican platform is for the Negro. And then again, you have this very racist depiction of a freedman, an African American, right here on the right, and it's just kind of another one of these propaganda pieces that existed in the South. So Grant's first term goes very smoothly. He gets this 15th Amendment really helps pass, and really this election goes pretty easily too. You can see down here that Grant ultimately takes the election by a landslide of electoral votes. The popular vote, his main competition was this man named Horace Greeley, and you can see the popular vote here, 3.6 million or so to 2.8 million in the South, or really the Democrats just in general. But so why the zero in the electoral vote? So this is a really rare instance, and it might be even unique in American history, that basically Horace Greeley actually died not very long after the election. So they were able to actually pass, have the votes counted, but the Electoral College hadn't met yet to actually cast the votes. So Horace Greeley died in between there, and that's actually, he wasn't going to get any votes because he was dead. So that's how most of these votes ended up, toward Ulysses S. Grant. And he won this election, pretty easily, and this second term is really where things are going to change, and he's going to start to really run into some problems and issues with corruption and scandals and things that plague his presidency. So as I just said, Grant's second term is really going to be plagued by a bunch of scandals. We're only going to really talk about 3 of them here, but there's actually, even more if you want to research into it yourself. But the big ones, here are this credit mobilier scandal, which is essentially you have this company that's working, helping to build, the Transcontinental Railroad, and what happens is the federal government ends up, agreeing to provide federal subsidies. So what, a subsidy is basically money that's provided by the government to help something in this case, or to a company to help the company out. So here's the catch here. The members of Congress in some cases were actually investors in this company. So when you have these members that are basically voting to spend federal money and give it to this company for for their efforts here to help them get it done quickly, because again, this people are trying to get a railroad down, and the railroads are super important for growth. But what happens is they are the investors. So when they're providing federal money, they're basically just taking that federal money as profits from the company, and are ultimately swindling the government out of money, if that makes sense, and you're just pocketing it. So your second one here is known as the salary grab, and this is when Congress actually granted themselves a 50% increase in pay. And not only that, President Grant actually receives a huge bump himself, and more closer to 100% with, from an increase from 25,000 to 50,000. So when you have a Congress and government officials basically electing to pay themselves more, again, this doesn't necessarily look very good to the public, and it's something that is going to be looked down upon. And the last one, which is probably actually the biggest one that plagues the Grant administration here, is this whiskey ring. And essentially, you have a bunch of whiskey distillers that are kind of coming to get out west, looking to kind of get away from the taxation and things and try to make some money. But ultimately, you have the Treasury Department kind of to find this out and essentially start taking bribes from these distillers and diverting these taxes to other things. And what really comes down to is that, again, this is mostly Republicans that are being implicated, Republican politicians here, and even the private secretary to the president, who is a man named General Orville E. Babcock, was indicted in this ring. And when you have someone that high up being implicated, it looks very bad upon Grant himself, as he's the president, and he's basically employing this person, and that's not very good for your own reputation. So, for Grant's sake anyway, he was not directly involved in the ring, but it doesn't really matter when you have someone like that underneath you who was. So those are the big ones that hurt this term, as far as Grant's term here and the reputation behind it. So those scandals and the corruption that had been taking place within the government really is going to drop the morale across the country. And people are just not going to be feeling really great about their country and the government at this point. And this is going to only be part of it, but it's leading into a period of time where you're going to have an economic depression for a number of years. Really, it starts off this panic of 1873, and the depression lasts probably for another 5 or so years. What's happening here is that you have this post-war inflation and rapid growth beginning to really take its toll, and strain on the country and the country's resources. So I just want to elaborate a little bit on that. And when you have this rapid growth, you begin producing more and more goods and services. And at some point, the production is going to kind of run away, and it's going to exceed the demand for these goods and services. And when that happens, if you don't slow down, you're going to be left with a major surplus of these goods. So when you have a surplus like that, you no longer need to produce as many goods. So who is producing those goods? Your everyday person. So when you have factories and mills and railroads and banks and things like that closing as a result of this, ultimately you're going to have major problems and major unemployment, around the country, and that unemployment leads to people not being able to provide for themselves, whether it's food or whatever other things they need to provide for themselves. To elaborate on the inflation a little bit, if you remember, that's when prices rise faster than the salaries and then the income. So in this case, you had major inflation during the war, so those people that are making, your standard salary as a worker here are the ones that are really getting pretty screwed. The problems that the country were facing, whether it was the economic depression or all the scandals and things that were going on under the Grant administration there at the end, really led to a major distrust now of the Republicans in certain cases, and this is going to lead to, for the first time, them losing control of their majority in Congress in the 1874 elections. For the first time, the Democrats are actually going to be in control at all since the Civil War, and that's going to now change everything when it really comes down to it. And just 2 years later, you're going to get a disputed presidential election as well. You have these two major candidates, Rutherford B. Hayes, who is a governor from Ohio who has a number of political reforms, who is believed to be a bit more moderate in the Reconstruction and in comparison to the last Republicans. And you also have this man named Samuel J. Tilden, who is the Democratic candidate, who is a corruption-killing governor from New York. So what happens is you get a major confusion of 20 electoral votes. So what happens is Tilden actually gets to 184 votes, and the last 20, you have some confusion, as I just said. So basically these votes from Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, no one really knows which way they went. You have some people saying they went this way or that, and it's a major problem, obviously. This is an election map, so this shows how close it really was, and in fact, you have Samuel Tilden actually winning the popular vote by over 250,000 popular votes or so. So how does Hayes actually win? What happens is when you have these electoral votes up for grabs, or that are confused anyway, you get what's called an Electoral Commission decided on how this is going to go. And initially, this commission is actually 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 kind of independent person. But ultimately, something happens to that independent, and a Republican ends up taking the spot, and this actually ends up just voting, along party lines. And as a result, Rutherford B. Hayes is awarded all of the electoral votes, which makes him now have 185, which is what was needed to win, and he becomes the next president. But really, this is going to now make the South very angry. They're not very happy with it. You have calls to march on Washington, and ultimately both branches of Congress are going to need to okay this decision. So what happens is the Southerners actually decide that, you know what, it's okay. If you guys agree to a certain number of conditions. Those conditions really are going to really end the Reconstruction effort for the most part. The first big one is that you have the last of the federal troops that had been placed there, under the Reconstruction Acts, are going to now be leaving the South. So this military occupation, if you will, is going to be gone, and you're going to have what becomes known as this home rule, where the South is going to once again be in charge of themselves here. And additionally, one Southerner is going to need to be granted a position in the presidential cabinet, in the cabinet, and other ones you have, for starters, basically they're saying that this improvements are going to need to be made in the South as well. Generous spending is going to need to be made, to help rebuild some of this infrastructure that had been destroyed in the South, during the war, and just to help kickstart the economy a bit. And lastly, Hayes is going to give these conservative Democrats, kind of control again of part of the local issues that are going on, and that kind of again reconstitutes this kind of home rule idea. So out of this, you get what is dubbed kind of the New South. And one of the big things now, with the Southerners not really having anyone watching their back, they begin to push back again against the African Americans, the freedmen. They don't want them to be able to vote, so they implement a couple of different things. For starters, you have what's known as a poll tax, and this is just a fee, that's required here to vote, which, again, if you are a poor African American who is a sharecropper and really have no additional income whatsoever, and it basically comes down to you providing food for your family at all, are you going to pay this tax to vote, or are you going to feed your family? So this poll tax, is limiting to the freedmen, obviously. They just might not even have the money when it really comes down to it. Additionally, you get the implementation of literacy tests, and these literacy tests are pretty insane, and we're going to be looking at them later in the school year. But when it comes down to it, these literacy tests are very difficult. They're worded, they're meant to be tricky, they're meant to trip you up, they're very difficult, and most people would not actually pass these tests. And how they get around that is they also implement what's called a grandfather clause. So this basically prevented whites from being able to fail those literacy tests, because the way the clauses work is they actually exempt anyone whose ancestors had voted in 1860. So in this case, everyone's ancestors had voted in 1860 except for the people who weren't allowed to vote until after. And those are the freedmen. So it's totally, again, just they're implementing these things to really bring the freedmen and the African American class down again here. So another thing that's happening in this New South is the rise of Southern industry. So you have many people in the South that are essentially arguing that, the industry in the North was a major factor in the war here, and that they need to start kind of catching up in these industries, in coal, iron, tobacco, cotton, lumber. You have these factories, producing these goods, and it's employing a large number of white people in this case, and in some smaller cases, you do have the African Americans being employed here too, but ultimately, that's gonna bring the South and provide some more economic stability to them moving forward. You also get the implementation of what is known as Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws are essentially lawful segregation. These laws required the African Americans and the whites to ultimately be separated in public settings. And you can see kind of down here on the bottom right where my mouse is, this how this ends up turning out. You have this separation, this segregation, and what becomes known as this Jim Crow car down here, and this car for the whites. And after the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, this whole separate but equal mentality. And that's going to bring us to our last point here, which is what I just kind of said, this Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case from 1896. And this basically okays the Jim Crow laws. It rules that the separation is legal as long as the African Americans had access to public facilities or accommodations that were equal to the whites. And this separate but equal mentality is really a funny one, because in this case, going back to the car that you just looked at, yes, they are both going to be effective, and they're both going to get you to, I guess, where you need to go as far as the train car is concerned, but one is significantly nicer than the other. But this is now okay, and this is going to be really legalizing this mentality for more than 50 years, really all the way up until, the civil rights movement in the 1950s, late 1950s and early 1960s. So that's really summing up our Reconstruction here, so I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.